The macro background is good today, but not likely to be so good in the coming year. That is going to color the government's assumptions, so it cannot make very robust assumptions. We must also remember that this budget that the FM presents is going to be the last full budget before general elections next year. And if disinvestment continues to do badly, there is no way the government can keep the fiscal deficit low unless it cuts back on expenditure. Fiscal deficit number is something that everybody looks to very keenly. When the fiscal deficit is very high, if government is going to borrow a very large amount, then ordinary private corporates will not be able to borrow much, because after all, the total pie from which they borrow, that is essentially household savings, is a given. So given the household savings, fiscal deficit, we say, is important. It has two roles. It can either crowd in private investment or it can crowd out. What we mean by saying crowding in is that if the government uses its fiscal deficit, its borrowings, to build roads, to build bridges, to build power plants, then you will find private investment coming in. Because the moment you build a road to, say, a port or to a railway station, people will be able to bring their produce to those areas, will be able to send to the rest of the country to export. So that kind of spending results in crowding in. But suppose a government were to spend its money, borrow and spend its money, say on something like fertilizer subsidies, on higher salaries to its staff, government pensions, etc. Those are unproductive spending. So the fiscal deficit, the quantity as well as the quality of the fiscal deficit is very important. So this is why the budget is so important. It has to make assumptions, because as you know, budget that the finance minister presents on the 1st of February is for the entire fiscal year, that is from April to March of the next year. So she has to project what is the kind of revenue I'm going to get, what are the kind of likely expenses. Now both these are based on assumptions. Assumptions of the revenue front will be determined by what is the kind of growth you're going to get. So on the 7th of January every year, the National Statistical Office release what is known as the advance estimates for that particular year's GDP growth. Now that becomes the base for the next year. Based on that, they worked out their tax projections, and the expenditure projections, frankly, are not that dependent on GDP, because a large part of government's expenditure, like salaries, pensions, interest, etc., are given. The government really doesn't have much of a choice. But to the extent that growth slows down, then government might have to support the bottom of the pyramid. So to that extent, the state of the economy determines your expenditure. But the state of the economy essentially determines what your revenues are going to be like. This year, for instance, because growth has been done quite well, we expected to end the year with growth at about 6.8%. Tax revenues have done very well. In fact, government revenues, both on GST front, which is basically from the commercial side, as well as personal income taxes, have done quite well. But for a variety of reasons, the government had actually budgeted that we'll get something like 65,000 crores from disinvestment. But as on date, we've done little over 20,000 crores. So there's a big gaping hole on the disinvestment front. That will be made up to some extent by revenue, that tax revenues have done well. Will that be enough to meet the higher expenditure of the government on fertilizer subsidy, on the food bill, etc.? That remains to be seen. If disinvestment continues to do badly, there's no way the government can keep the fiscal deficit low unless it cuts back on expenditure. So the thing it needs to do is not cut back on expenditure hugely, but reorient and redirect its expenditure towards capital spending. Because when the government invests, it lays the building blocks for future growth. This this year the government had budgeted that you'll end the year with a deficit of what? 6.4%. Chances are that we'll either meet that or perhaps be able to come a little lower, maybe about 6.2 or 6.3. And the next year's fiscal deficit, that will be determined by what assumptions the government makes. We must also remember that this budget that the FM presents is going to be the last full budget before general elections next year. So we'll have to see, will the government play the populist card? Will it announce large giveaways? Because at the end of the day, we must remember that every time when you have elections, it's not the rich who go out and vote. It is the lower middle class, the poor who go out to vote.